Shepherds dominated the quay. I better tell you a little bit about the shepherds. I've got documentary evidence of shepherds in Newport in the 14th century. In 1340, there was a family of shepherds living in Powell Street. And it was in 1375 that the family of shepherds was living in the High Street. Now that's a very important date because 2 years later, the French totally sacked the town. I think they destroyed every building except 2 stone buildings. So, but what happened to the residents of the town? You can only imagine that they sought refuge in Carisbrooke Castle. But in 1391, the abbot and brothers of St. Cross Priory housed the family of shepherds at St. Cross Quay, which is down Little London, and housed them there. But why would they choose the shepherds? I'll tell you why. Because the shepherds, even at that time, were described as fishermen, so they had boats. And they used to take the brothers from the religious house of St. Cross over to God's House, Southampton, and that St. Cross Priory owned a tremendous amount of land right along the river, including Wearer Farm. And they would take produce over to God's House, Southampton. That's the only reason why the shepherds were favoured. And the number of times that they entered the dock of Southampton is registered in the dock registers over there. Any amount of times. They must have made quite regular trips. But mind you, remember that was all sailing ships, so it was subject to the wind. And apart from that, shepherds also done all sorts of things. Removals. You can just imagine turning up with a thing like that, 2 horses and perhaps 3 or 4 fellows there, and that was the furniture removal van. That shows you just how crowded the river was. The boats all there. But mind you, that is only the core of the quay. The quay itself extended almost the entire length of C Street with warehouses of all description. And at each end, that would be almost at the Holy Road Street in one side, almost in the High Street the other, there were open coal yards. So all the coal that was used in the town then would come up, and these small barges could go right up, almost up to the High Street or up to Holy Road Street, and discharge their coal on these open wharves. Here's a picture of the warehouses going from the quay towards the High Street. That was one of the most memorable buildings on the quay. It was called the Ark. It's built on an old lighter. And it was the fellow that owned it had all these little boats. He used to let them out so as you could go rowing down the quay. When we became mechanised and had cranes on the quay, there were 3. The one right up at the head of the quay would lift 4 tons. The one a bit further down would lift 8 tons. But the one right down below Jubilee Stores would lift 12 tons. And the reason for that was the tide, the water level was less as you got further up the quay. So when you think of those cranes, if you had a container weighing 6 tons, and if that was in the bottom of the boat, in the bottom of the hold of the boat, to raise it high enough to bring it round and land it on a lorry, that would take 25 minutes, and there were 4 men winding that crane. So Crouchers weren't going to pay for half an hour's what they done, they carried it as deck cargo, and you only had to raise it a foot and swing it round, 10 minutes all over. They weren't going to have men stood about for half an hour. These modern mills like Ranks in Southampton, they could handle hundreds of tons a day. And those mills there, they'd only turn out 2 or 3 tons in a day, as long as they could work. And I'll just bring that picture in now. It's an amazing picture. That's taken in 1880, when we had the year of the big snow, and the people talked about it for centuries. And you could see what the state was on the quay at that time. we talk about freezing. In 1963, we had a really severe winter, and I went down to Herstake and I walked across the Medina on the ice. It's the only time I've ever been able to do it. I'll show you this picture now, but it's looking across to Little London, and you'll see there's a terrace of houses there. I take it they had water problem, so they pitched them. They were black, and they were known as black houses. But next to it is St Cross Pier Cottage, which my Anna Shepherd, my great-great-grandmother, she lived there all her married life, and alongside of it was the Odessa Boatyard. And if you turned in from C Street into Little London in 1800, the Newport, which was a canal at that time, the only bridge, there was no buildings built over the canal, but there was a footbridge, and it was just a footbridge over there, and there was only a footpath down Little London from that point. But it was in, well, I'm trying to think of the date, 1880 something, the date's on the building, and once you got over the quay there, Shepherds had an open quay, and they wanted that piece of open quay to put the railway arch over, and that was Shepherds' opportunity, and they were going to make the most of that, and so that when they negotiated it, they had enough money to move down below the railway bridge so they weren't inconvenienced. And we'll come to that in just a second. And they also had spare capacity after the bridge was built. But Shepherds didn't want to know, it was the wrong side of the bridge. And there's what they call today the rope store. And Robert Croucher had that built. He bought the land. But if you look at the roof, that roof is unique. It's colossal. I'm pretty certain that when it was built, some carpenter or something went up there and just done it. But when they replaced it a few years ago, they sent to London to get it created for them. They couldn't work it out. It's incredible, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The most favoured places down Little London today is the Bargeman's Rest. Yes, and there's a picture of it before it ever became the Gardener's Rest, the Bargeman's Rest, and that was Shepherds' model derrick store. The derrick in the front was on the same principle as the mast and derrick on a ship. But when you think about that, why did they build it back from the quay wall? What was the point of it? Why not build it on the quay wall? Well, very simple answer to that. There was a footpath along the top of the water, and that was sacrosanct. They couldn't build on that footpath, and so therefore they had to put that mast and derrick in midway between the store and the quay, so that they'd swing round, pick up the goods, take it round, drop it into the store. There's another picture shows you very much how busy that was at that time. In this picture you can see the ark, and you can also see what was Shepherds' model store at Little London. Model store because it contained every handling device known at that time. Hoists, various levels of loading and that sort of thing, and they called it model store. But in front of it is a steamship. That was built in 1896, and they had two, the foam and the spray, and they were built by J.S. White's. And until that date, they couldn't guarantee delivery because it was all sale. And when they brought them in, they could guarantee a daily service. So that was pretty good, wasn't it? I believe what they always told me was it was a busy place. Very much modelled, yes, I've been modelled on London. London always sought to be busy, and so it was Little London. Now, when you go down, you walk down Little London, and you're walking at the edge of the quay, and suddenly you've got to go inland. And at that point there's a spur of land between the river and the footpath, or the road today, and that is from that store there, or it's a block of flats now, right down to Broken Bridge, where that model of a young lady sits on the stone. And that was always known as St. Cross Pier. But when you think about it, St. Cross Pier, you imagine something like you see at the seaside, but it wasn't. It was this spur of land right the way down. And of course, obviously there were wooden structures leading it over the mud to the vessels. And it was on there that there was this building known as St. Cross Pier House. And it was in 1391, that the shepherds were housed there. And right up until Anna Shepherd died at the end of the 19th century, there were shepherds. Not only that, shepherds was involved in the quay in every activity. There wasn't an activity. At one time they leased the oyster beds, and the oyster beds run right the way along the river bank then that time, and they also collected the dues. They didn't pay dues themselves. They had grandfather rights. They'd been there so long they didn't pay the council dues, but they collected the dues from other people, and they paid, I think it was about £400 a year. So it must have been profitable, because the shepherds wouldn't have handled it unless they were going to make a profit out of it. And they used to collect the dues for the council. Paid £400 a year and then collect the dues. Well, of course, there were oyster beds, quite big business. But when you think about it, all the sewage from Newport and everything else come down. I suppose that fed the oysters, but that didn't worry our ancestors, did it? No. Oh yeah, the Newport Quay was a wonderful stream for trout. There's records of trout 6 and 7 pound in weight at Towngate Mill. Towngate Mill, of course, had that very special mill pond. The water from the Newport Quay didn't run directly into the stream. It ran alongside. You had the mill pond, and then there was a stone wall, and there were ports in that wall. The stream came down, the water could run through into the mill pond, but anything that would damage the mill wheel wouldn't get through, so they had to carry on down. And in that stream, he was between 8 and 12 feet deep. He was only a small pond, but you used to have wonderful trout there. And up at behind the 8 Bells, the landlord of the 8 Bell used to loan punts. You could hire them, and you could fish from them. And of course, that was a rich man's sport. And the mill ponds would silt up, and every so often there was an advertisement in the county press to say that on such and such a Saturday, that all the loose sluice gates would be open to allow the water to rush through and take the silt with it. So that Saturday, us lads used to go up to the foot of Carriesbrook High Street, and we used to make a barrier across the stream of pebbles, and the water had to come over the top of that, and so did the fish. And we had little strips of metal. They were bed laths, because the beds had a metal base, and we used to wait for them to come and catch them. Then we used to have a good feed of fish. Yeah. Chief hobby as a boy in the spring was birds' eggs. And I had a wonderful collection of birds, almost 100 species of nesting birds on the island. I had this wonderful collection of birds' eggs. And, but quite a lot of boys collected birds' eggs in those days. And it wasn't until it was banned that it stopped, you know. It was a totally different way of life. You couldn't understand it today. And of course, we went out in the countryside, and after everything, especially conkers. And do they still play conkers today? I suppose they do. But we used to go to Conker Avenue in Blackwater Road. And that's from the Blackwater Road up to West Standon Farm. And the funny thing about that is, those trees are the same as when I was a boy 80 years ago. They don't seem to have grown. I can't understand that. But gas came to Newport in 1820, but the gasworks was at Pan Bridge. And by 1850, I suppose it extended through the town and they wanted bigger works. So they came down to the edge, almost to the edge of the quay. And the coal itself had to be carted across the quay and into the quay, into the works there. The picture that you're looking at shows you a gas retort. That was built in 1937. And it was only there for 12 years, and then it was demolished because they had a new works at East Cowes that supplied the whole island. I can't be sure whether it was oil or solid fuel, but it was probably oil at that time. And they would have employed 30 or 40 people with the, what's it called? One of the main users of the quay was New Langton's Brewery. And that was a surprisingly big brewery. It had over 100 public houses, a lot of them in the New Forest. So therefore they had to carry their beer over to Lymington. And initially, when it was quite small, it was subcontracted. A small vessel would take it over, and then they purchased their own. The first one was called the White, but the one we're looking at in the picture there was the 4X. And the 4X was one of their brands of beer. There was a favourite brand of beer. Barrel beer came down from the brewery, down the Newport, and when it got down to what today is the Quay Arts Centre, if you go in there, you'll see that there's a little crane and there's like a railway line run around. Well, the beer could be lifted out of the barge, out of these little dumb barges, put on those rails and pushed round to the boat just round in the quay. It was and the state of the tide didn't make any difference because at where the Newport joins the Medina, you'll find that there was lock gates. So when the tide was high, they'd close the lock gates, keep the water in, and this work could go on at any time. It wasn't subject to the tide, so the little boats could come down and bring the beer down and load it. That was quite ingenious. That picture shows you just how busy the quay could be. You can see all the timber along the quay, and the timber came in the autumn. It came down from Scandinavia in very large vessels which could only get in as far as Medham. Then it was transferred to barges and brought up to Newport Quay and landed, and they weren't allowed to use any wires or anything to hoist. It had to be all manhandled, and that employed all the casual labourers that used to stand at the bottom of Quay Street hoping for work. And those large buildings in the front are drying sheds. They put the timber in them, and they were slat-sided. They had slats with gaps in between each upright, and the wind would go through and dry the timbers. Since it was always full, there were so many different things that come in there. Cadbury's chocolates used to come in a container, and that was loaded onto a lorry, and the lorry went right round the island delivering Cadbury's products. Lyons tea came in a container. That used to go up into Crater's store in Quay Street and offload, and then the representative, Lyons representative, he had quite a large van, and he would go round and he would sell it all around the shops. Before the road bridge was put over there, it was a railway viaduct, a railway bridge, and a section of that would slide back to allow the mass of the ships to come through to the town quay. And it caused a lot of trouble because they couldn't open it because the trains were due, and many times the ships lost the tide, and then of course they'd lost 12 hours before they could go again. So that was quite an inconvenience. It was tremendous. That's the type of vessels that Craters had 11 of those type of vessels. And you can see that's fairly old because it never had a wheelhouse. It had a canvas screen, like what they called a dodger. So that was quite a journey coming across there. There's a building that you can see from the quay. It was the Electric Light Works, and that was built about 1900. But of course, the coal never come into the quay because the railway was working then between Cowes and Newport, and the coal would have come up in trucks direct to the watch court. Very interesting. It was a lovely building. It's still there today, but it's almost derelict. It's a great shame. One funny thing about that was when that was in Newport, and most of the towns in the island had their own electricity stations. Ryde had one in Bennett Street. There was Sandown Shankton was at Skew Bridge. Ventnor Rail Station was right alongside the railway station, and yet Cowes never had an electric light works. It was supplied from Newport, and there's still evidence of that. If you walk along the cycle track between Newport and Cowes, which was originally the railway track, look on the side of the track and you'll find that there are these small concrete posts with a concave top, and the cable that supplied Cowes used to lay along the top of those swatch cords. In the days of sail, there's the Arrow in full rig, ketch rigged, I think they called that. That was one of Shepherd's sailing boats. When we were doing this luggage, what they call passengers' luggage in advance, it was only paid to the door of the boarding house or hotel. And some of those trunks, they were really heavy, and that's good. So we had an agreement with almost all of the boarding houses and hotel proprietors. We would take it up and put it outside the door it had to go. And when we had to collect it, they only had to put it outside the door and we collected it. But we got a shilling for every trunk we carried down and 6pence for every suitcase. I got more money some Saturdays than I got for a week's wages, even with perhaps 20, 30 hours overtime. I was courting at the time, and we would, on the Sunday evening, of course, we would go to the Medina Theatre, and we could walk past the 6penny seats, and we'd go to the posh ones at the back, 1 and 6pence. We were really proud. That was really something. Yeah, there was more comradeship in those days. It was everybody sort of helped each other, and working on the quay, it was a wonderful community. It was hard work, and yet everybody, if you were working hard and somebody had finished their job, they were there with you, helping you. It was a wonderful situation. There was no doubt about that. It was really superb. What they'd done heavy haulage. There was no crane on the quay capable of lifting certain items, and this was a boiler. This was a boiler going to Whitecroft in 1896, and there's a picture of it showing the 22 agricultural horses that they used to pull it to Whitecroft. And if you can imagine that going up Quay Street, Newport, what a scene that would have been today, wouldn't it? It'd been absolutely wonderful. But of course, by the time there's a picture, that picture is a painting on my wall in my flat. That's Carriagebook Road, just before they turned into Castle Road. But by 1919, when they took the boiler to St Mary's, they had steam power. The first 2 engines belonged to Shepherd's, but the third one was an agricultural machine, which was much heavier, and it wouldn't rear when they started to pull the load. And there it is there. And again, that is a picture on the wall of my flat.
That's going up Honey Hill, isn't it?
Yes, it's the base of Honey Hill.
Yes.
Yeah. One very interesting piece there, they stopped to take water on, so they had plenty of water for the engines. And Frank Shepherd said, I'll go up top of the hill and see if it's all clear. And so he went up the top of the hill, and before he could get back down there, they were coming up the hill, and he was quite annoyed because he wanted to be there to see them go up. I want to introduce these two to show you what the quay looked like. No, don't remember that one. Before the quay was extended, amazingly enough, there was no quay beyond the railway bridge until 1900, and the wall was built there between 1900 and 1906. So it's incredible that they managed without that right up to that date. All I haven't got is a picture of the Green Store. It was a long store with about 8 loading bays out on the road, and that was Crater's store. On the one end was Tate and Lyle's sugar, all their sugar. The sugar used to come down in a vessel called the Fife Coast. She was a coaster, quite a big vessel, and certainly the largest vessel that ever came up to Newport Quay. She would come up quite regular, but of course, being a coaster, she would carry perhaps 350, 400 tonne. But she'd go into Portsmouth first, discharge most of it, leave perhaps 130 tonnes on board of sugar, and it was time for the spring high tide. And she would come up to Newport and stop outside what was called the Green Store and unload the sugar. And that went to one end of that store. At the other end, it was all the great big rolls of newsprint for County Press. And County Press at that time, if they had 3 rolls, it was an 8-page newsprint. If it was 4 rolls, if it was a 12-page, they wanted 4 rolls. And that was delivered every Friday, ready for the printing. Now this is a remarkable building, it's still there, and this is the Jubilee stores. Jubilee. Crater's owned it, but they never had it built. Thomas Gator and Bradfield, who were corn merchants and owned Pan Mill, they had that built, and it was built in 1922. And after that period, Thomas Gator and Bradfield got into trouble, and it was 1935. They sold that to try and solve their debts. They sold it to Crater's, and that was the store just for Ranks flour. So you can imagine how much that would hold. And we used to come down there, under these there was a chute come down, load the flour and away to go. That is a lucum, and you won't find that word in the English dictionaries. And what that actually done was, Crater's never used it, there was no point for them, but when Thomas Gator and Bradford had it, they would be bringing in the cereals, wheat and that sort of thing, and wheat was in 2.5 underweight sacks. There was no way you could pull them up and pull them in. But if they went up there into the lucum, the floor of that lucum was hinged in 2 halves, and as the sack come up, the 2 parts of the floor would open, the sack would come through, the floor would drop back into place, drop the sack down, you could truck it away. And Jubilee, it was in 1935 when Crater's took it over. They named it Jubilee Stores. 1935 was the Silver Jubilee of King George V. He was crowned king in 1910. That's why it's called Jubilee Store. That is a very good picture of the quay about 1900. And the large building on the right-hand side of the picture was the Fountain Inn. And men started work at 6 o'clock, but before they started work, they would have a pint of beer. They didn't drink tea at home, so they came and they would have a pint of beer there. And I'll tell you a nice little story about that. There was a fellow by the name of Bill Gale. He was the skipper of one of Shepherd's boats, and he was tremendous. He was really crusty. Everything seemed to annoy him. And he was in there one day having a drink, and it was one of those days, it was a severe gale, lashing wind, and he was in there having a drink, and of course he was supposed to go to Southampton with the vessel. Frank Shepherd called across the quay to a lad on one of the boats on the other side of the quay and said, "Would you go up and tell Bill Gale that we know he's frightened of a little bit of wind?" And he said, "So don't bother to go to Southampton today." And of course the lad, in all his innocence, went up and opened the door of the pub and called out, "Uncle Bill, Mr. Shepherd says he knows you're frightened of a bit of wind, so don't bother to go to Southampton. Bill Gell had a glass in his hand, he threw it across the room, smashed against the wall, tore out, and of course the lad thought he was chasing him, but the lad went down the quay. Bill Gell went along C Street and down Watchcourt, and the ship was ready to leave. His other members of the crew were there, and they say it was the fastest trip that any vessel ever made to Southampton. There was a telephone call from Cowes which said, your vessel have just gone out through and the sails are almost parallel with the water, with the wind. And he went up to Southampton and there was another telephone call and they said, we've never seen anything like this. Your vessel came in, it was in full sail when it was reached the dock. Instead of that, it went past, made a sharp turn, came back, and the curtains and the sails come down like the curtains in a theatre. And he'd come in there and you wouldn't have crushed an egg. That was Bill Gell. He was a tremendous character. And I'd just as well at this stage tell you the other story about Bill Gell. The Shepherd's vessel was over on the quayside, not Little London. And I suppose they were working under the crane, and perhaps Frank Shepherd thought they was over there a bit long. So he came out, shouted across to Bill Gell, are you on the mud? No, we're not on the mud. And of course that started a row. And it ended up by Bill Gell saying, when you're up there, pointing to the cemetery, he said, I should come up there and being polite, I'll urinate on your grave. Frank Shepherd replied, if you go first, I should be up every night doing that. That was the kind of characters that were on the quay. They were tremendous. But in this picture also is a little hand cart. That was a baker's cart. They used to carry the bread round in, all the loaves. On Sunday evenings there was a live show. You had people like Charlie Chester and those sort of people. Who was the fellow Brown who used to play the xylophone? He was another one. And all the top names came to the Medina Theatre, and it was wonderful, you know. Charlie Chester, he was near the knuckle, you know. And he told one joke there, I remember. He said, of course, Newport was a garrison town, and these ATS girls was walking up through the street and they met the military police, and the military police said, you're out after hours. And they said, no, we're not, you're out after hours. My interest in the countryside has been with me all my life, and that was through my father. My father, he worked, of course, when he started back in about 1900, he drove a horse and cart, and they would start at 6:30, and one of his journeys, which he normally done, was through to Ryde, Seaview, St Helens, Bembridge, Brading, and then back over the down. And when he got to there and Hounds, he always said the horse was dry, so he had to give him the drink. I don't know if he had one as well, but I'm sure he did. And on a Sunday, he used to use the countryside, but I can only describe it as for what's in it for him. And he used to collect blackberries, hazelnuts, anything you mushrooms, of course, and they were plentiful in those days. He'd collect them, and he was very well known, and used to make up great bunches of flowers summertime and give them away, you know. But he used to take me out every spring. We used to go out, I had a little ferry cycle. We used to go out to Highwood Lanes, that's between Chillerton and Rookley, get off our cycles, walk along slowly and watch the bank and see the first adder of the spring. And that it triggered my interest in the countryside, and I never lost it. And of course that's developed, and I've been examining the countryside ever since, you would say for almost 90 years. But and my chief interest all the way through have always been flowers. So with my colleagues, Jim Beavis and Reg Cattell, we produced the Flora of the Isle of Wight, which was, that took us about 15 years of field work, gradually working right through, and It was a labour of love, no doubt about that. And that's what I used to do on a Sunday. And even winter time, I'd go bird watching, go out to Newtown, cycle out to Newtown and go bird watching. And I've done that from as young as age as ever I can remember. I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. I had a ferry cycle, and in the family conversation, they were always talking about Gunville Harbour. And of course, I was intrigued by this, and I got on to my father and kept on to him. I said, I want to go to Gunville Harbour. And one Sunday, I must have mentioned it, and he said, oh, all right, I'll take you up there, he said, and you'll see it. So we went up there, and we got up there where the railway bridge was, where the engine went under the road, and we looked out across there, all these houses, and Father says, tide's out. So we turned round and come back down to the 8 Bells. He had a pint of beer and I had a glass of lemonade. Oh yeah, it was wonderful times, you know. You can imagine that travelling around with some lorries from about 7 or 8 years of age, I had a vast knowledge of the island. I knew the towns as well as any person, you know. And of course all the conversation with the drivers and all that, they tell you all sorts of things, you know. Crouchers had 2 steam wagons, and one of the tales they always told there was when they went to freshwater, they got to the top of Tapnell, and you know it's downhill for about a mile, and they'd throw the engine out of gear, and that engine would run down there and right down to Afton Road before they had to put it back in gear. So, and you can imagine that the steersman was on the side of the vehicle, and it was a changed steering. My goodness, he must have wound that thing round tremendously. Yeah. James's Street, father, of course, was very well known in the town, where he was delivering all the different shops. And you go into a grocer's, and they said, "You want some bacon scraps, Bill?" That's where the slicer machine on the counter used to cut off a slice of bacon, and perhaps there was odds and ends, and he'd bring over these great bagfuls of cuttings, and of course that made lovely puddings, and so that was quite a treat. And also there was a firm in Newport called the Central Confectionery, and they used to deliver all over the island sweets, and of course when the travellers came they brought samples, and when Father went there he always had a load of samples to bring home, all these sweets, so we were never short of sweets. Biscuits, of course, was sweet biscuits, that would have been quite a treat. And a little story, my brother, he was 6 years my senior, and he went with Mother round to Caden Sherwood's, the grocers in Upper St James's Street, and he had a penny to spend, and he said to Mr Cave, the grocer, "Oh, I want some biscuits, Mr Cave." And Mr Cave, being thoughtful, said to Jack, "Do you want broken biscuits, Jack?" "No thanks, Mr Cave, I'm broken myself." He was quite capable of doing that. He didn't want broken biscuits. And my sister, who was much older, I don't know how that came about, but she was in her teens long before I was born, and she had to go round to Kirby's in Node Hill to get, and she was supposed to get some belly pork, but she thought belly was rude, so she asked for stomach pork. Yeah, that was all the little things that made my life worth living. Entertainment, my father, he wasn't a heavy drinker, but he always went to the Grapes, the public house in Node Hill, on a Saturday evening, because that evening was community singing. It didn't start until 9 o'clock, and every week the sequence of the songs they were going to sing never changed, so everybody who attended knew exactly what was coming. And being soon after the First World War and the problems in Ireland, a lot of it was Irish songs, Danny Boy, Mountains of Mourne, all those. And at 5 to 10, the landlord would say, "Time, gentlemen, please," and that was the cue for the last song of the evening. And it was always, "You'll never miss your mother till she's gone." And the crowd there, you couldn't believe it. And you know, I've come through St James's Square of a summer evening, and the doors would be open in the pub, and you could hear it from St James's Square. But it was amazing. There was the only lady I ever knew at that time that ever went to a pub, and that was Carrie Liverton, and she used to go round for the community singing, and she had a Windsor chair in the corner of the bar, and nobody else used it. And of course, she was always plied with a few drinks, gin, of course. And when they got to this, "You'll never miss your mother till she's gone," Carrie was sat there with the tears running down her cheeks every Saturday. Never got used to it. That was the, you could say that was the workshop of the island. There wasn't, when life was so simple, there wasn't anything that you couldn't get in St James's Street. And of course the market was there, so you can imagine it. And 19 public houses in that one street, that's quite incredible. But when you think about 19 public houses, you didn't have to go far, you didn't get very dry between each one. It was really something. 19 public houses, they were absolutely fantastic. I could name them all, but I hadn't better. I was going to. There was one or two very special ones. There was the Trooper just alongside of Towngate Mill, and that's very aptly named when you think about it. And only a little way up was the Star Hotel. That was a posh place. So the carriages came in, stopped at the front of the hotel, discharged their passengers, went into the yard at the back of the hotel, stabled the horses and left the carriage. Then they went into the Star Tap. A tap was a bar where the coachmen and that sort of thing, they weren't allowed to go into with the gentry, and so they went into the tap. Now, there's a place there, the shop is empty. It used to be, in my days, it was G.B. Purkis, clothiers. Of course, there were no credit cards, nothing like that. But we had an account. You had a card, and when you had enough money on this card, you could go there. Mother would say, "Bill, you would have to have a new pair of trousers," or something like that. And we could go there, and there was enough money already paid in so that you could take the trousers or shirt out. Couldn't do it otherwise. No such thing as credit. But what was G.B. Purkis's, was a pub called Pig and Carrot. Well, what a funny name for a pub, eh? But it's a corruption. Pig is really piquet, which was a card game. And carrot is a corruption of carouse, in pleasant company. So you played cards in pleasant company. And at the back of that was the Crown Brewery, so they didn't have to take it very far. I could tell you so much about St James's Street. The Lamb Hotel was on the corner of St James's Square and the High Street. It's a phone shop or something now, but their beer used to come across the pavement, and there was a grating, and the beer used to go down that grating and into the cellar. On a Tuesday, market day, much of the business between the farmers was done by cash. They nearly all had a leather pouch with their money in. And if they stood there, a coin might drop and go down onto a platform where the beer would be run off. And my brother, who was at Barton School at the time, he would come up the high street, over to that grating, look down in there, and if there was a coin there, he'd tear round to our home in Orchard Street, and out in the shed, he had a hazel stick about 4 foot long, and a tin of putty in linseed oil, so it was nice and loose, and he'd put a plug on the end of the stick, go down there and pull up, perhaps it might be only a halfpenny, a penny, but if it was a sixpence, just imagine it. You could buy 10 wrapped toffees for 1 penny, 1 old penny. only you want 2.5 of them for one modern penny. So you could see what you could buy for 6pence. It lasted us in sweets for a week anyway. It was pretty good. Mother always let him keep it, the money, you know. And she thought that was quite ingenious to do that. But what you did have in St James's Street, there was pork butchers. Hyles was a pork butcher, Abraham's was a pork butcher, Kirby's was a pork butcher. That was strange. And of course pork was sold separate from the other meats. Apparently it wouldn't keep before refrigeration, so it had to be sold quick. And so most of they separated. They were a beef, lamb butcher or a pork butcher. And Abraham's used to have all this Christmas display. Any amount, cover the front of the shop with all these carcasses at Christmas, so as you'd see what you were buying. It was incredible. It was wonderful really. And then of course, if you walked a bit further up, you get to the George, and then the road widens. Well, but it didn't before about 1935. There was a row of very, very old properties along there, and in one of those there was a cooper by the name of Chiverton. He made barrels and things like that. And you know that man made all these wooden markers that marked the channel down to Southampton Water. He made them there, and they transported over there. And there's a Beavis's. That was I suppose you would call it a church, a religious house. It was congregational, and they used to run the boys' brigade. And at one time, that boys' brigade was over 200 strong, and they had wonderful uniforms with the little pillbox hats and that sort of thing. They used to parade around the town, band and all, and it was marvellous to see them, you know. And another band you always had on Sunday nights in the market was the Salvation Army. They used to leave their headquarters in Paul Street, go up Paul Street, and come down to High Street, and then they would form a big circle in St James's Square, and they would play music. And you can't believe how many people went down to listen to that music. The square was filled of a Sunday evening. There was always some kind of entertainment, but it was simple. At the bottom of Honey Hill, you got the pond there, but that was never a mill pond. The water had already passed Towngate Mill, but before it joined St Cross Mill, it had to go under the road. And that was where, when you think about 1533, Newport had a livestock market. But there was no water in the town. The residents got their water from wells, and even they dried up in the summer, and water was imported from Carisbrooke. And so when you came in with animals, you gave them a drink as you come in to the market, and you gave them a drink when they went out. Oh, my mother, she was true to her children and her home. She was kind and true and loved us all. Oh, pray God for her sweet name, for she was always just the same. You'll never miss your mother till she's gone.